Sheriff married a deaf girl to protect her from the town, then realized she heard his heartbeat. Chapter 1. The Silent Girl. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls, Wyoming territory, as Sheriff Thomas Gray made his usual rounds through the small frontier town. At 31, Thomas was a man of few words who preferred the company of his thoughts to the idle chatter that filled the saloons and general stores. His quiet nature and steady demeanor had earned him respect, but it had also kept him isolated, a solitary figure maintaining order in a world that often seemed determined to create chaos. As he passed Murphy's General Store, the sound of raised voices and cruel laughter drew his attention. A small crowd had gathered near the loading dock, their faces twisted with the kind of mean-spirited amusement that made Thomas's jaw clench with anger. "Look at her just standing there like a statue," called out Jake Morrison, the town blacksmith, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "Deaf and dumb as a post. Maybe if we yell loud enough, she'll finally hear us," added another voice, followed by more laughter. Thomas pushed through the crowd with the quiet authority that had served him well in his 5 years as sheriff. In the center of his circle stood a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, with long auburn hair that caught the morning light like burnished copper. She was small and delicate, wearing a simple brown dress that had seen better days, and she held herself with a dignity that seemed almost regal despite her circumstances. What struck Thomas most powerfully was her face, beautiful in a way that seemed untouched by the harshness of frontier life, with large hazel eyes that watched the crowd with a mixture of wariness and resignation. She showed no reaction to the jeers and taunts being hurled at her, not because she was ignoring them, but because she couldn't hear them. "What's going on here?" Thomas asked, his voice cutting through the noise with calm authority. "Just having some fun with the deaf girl, Sheriff," Morrison replied with a smirk. "Found her sleeping in the alley behind the store this morning. Figured we ought to wake her up proper." Thomas felt anger building in his chest as he took in the scene. The young woman's dress was wrinkled and dirty, suggesting she had indeed spent the night outdoors. Her thin frame and the hollow look around her eyes spoke of hunger and exhaustion. Everything about her situation screamed of desperation and vulnerability. "Her name's Clara," offered Mrs. Henderson, the store owner's wife, with more sympathy than the men had shown. "Clara Whitfield. She came in yesterday, asking for work, but—" Mrs. Henderson shrugged helplessly. "What use is a girl who can't hear instructions or talk to customers?" Thomas stepped closer to Clara, noting how she tracked his movement with intelligent eyes. When he was close enough to see the flecks of gold in her hazel irises, he slowly removed his hat in a gesture of respect. Clara's eyes widened slightly at the courtesy, as if she wasn't accustomed to being treated with such consideration. "Miss Whitfield," Thomas said, speaking slowly and clearly so she could read his lips, "are you all right?" Clara studied his mouth as he spoke, then nodded once, a barely perceptible movement that somehow conveyed both gratitude and continued wariness. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" This time Clara shook her head, and Thomas caught a glimpse of fear in her expression before she quickly masked it with that same dignified composure. "She's been wandering around town for 2 days," Mrs. Henderson explained. "Poor thing's obviously hungry and tired, but nobody knows what to do with her. Can't exactly put her to work if she can't hear instructions. Maybe the territorial authorities could take her to one of those institutions," suggested Morrison. "Places for people like her, where they know how to handle them." Thomas had heard about such places, grim establishments where people with disabilities were often warehoused rather than cared for. The thought of this graceful young woman being sent to such a fate made his stomach turn. "Miss Whitfield," Thomas said, again speaking slowly, "where are you from?" Clara pointed eastward, then held up fingers in a gesture that Thomas interpreted as indicating distance or time. Her movements were precise and eloquent, suggesting an intelligence that her inability to hear and speak had never diminished. "Family." Clara's expression grew sad, and she shook her head definitively. Thomas understood. She was alone in the world, with no one to protect or provide for her. The crowd was beginning to disperse, their entertainment value exhausted, but Thomas could see the calculating looks in some of their eyes. A young, defenseless woman with no family and no means of support would be seen as easy prey by the wrong kind of men. In a town like Cedar Falls, where law and order often depended more on personal strength than official authority, Clara would be vulnerable to abuse or worse. "Sheriff," Morrison said, clapping Thomas on the shoulder with false familiarity, "you can't just let her wander around town. She's going to be nothing but trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Thomas asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Morrison's smirk told him everything he needed to know. "Well, a girl like that with no family to protect her, men might get ideas. Might think she's available for certain kinds of work, if you catch my meaning." Thomas's hand moved instinctively to his gun belt, and Morrison stepped back quickly, recognizing the dangerous gleam in the sheriff's eyes. "I catch your meaning perfectly," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. "And I'm here to tell you and anyone else who might be getting such ideas that Miss Whitfield is under my protection. Anyone who bothers her will answer to me personally." "Your protection?" Mrs. Henderson asked, curiosity evident in her voice. "Sheriff, you can't just adopt every stray that wanders into town." Thomas looked at Clara again, seeing the way she watched his face with such intensity, trying to understand what was being decided about her fate. In that moment, an idea formed in his mind. Crazy, impractical, but perhaps the only way to ensure her safety. "You're right, Mrs. Henderson," Thomas said slowly. "But I can marry her." The words hung in the air like a gunshot, and Clara's eyes went wide with shock. She had clearly read his lips and understood what he had just proposed. "Marry her," Morrison sputtered. "Sheriff, you can't be serious. She's deaf and mute. What kind of marriage would that be?" "The kind that gives her legal protection and social respectability," Thomas replied firmly, never taking his eyes off Clara's face. "The kind that ensures no one in this town will dare to mistreat her." Clara stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and something that might have been gratitude. Then very slowly she nodded. "Miss Whitfield," Thomas said gently, "I'm offering you my name and my protection. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she held his gaze steadily as she nodded again, more firmly this time. Then she did something that took Thomas's breath away. She placed her small hand over her heart and then pointed to him, a gesture so eloquent that words would have been inadequate. As the crowd dispersed, buzzing with gossip about the sheriff's unprecedented decision, Thomas offered Clara his arm. She took it with the grace of a lady, and together they walked toward the church to speak with Reverend Patterson about performing a marriage ceremony. Neither of them spoke, Clara because she couldn't, Thomas because he was still processing what he had just committed to. But as they walked in comfortable silence, Thomas found himself acutely aware of the small hand resting on his arm, of the trust Clara was placing in a stranger, and of the strange sense of rightness that seemed to settle over him like a well-worn coat. He had always been a man of duty, and this was just another duty, protecting someone who couldn't protect herself. At least, that's what he told himself as they approached the church where he would bind his life to that of a woman he had known for less than an hour. Reverend Patterson was a kind man in his 50s who had performed many unusual ceremonies during his time on the frontier, but when Thomas explained the situation, even he seemed taken aback by the request. "Sheriff Gray," the Reverend said carefully, "marriage is a sacred institution, not merely a legal convenience. Are you certain this is the path God intends for you both?" Thomas looked at Clara, who sat quietly in the front pew of the small church, her hands folded in her lap as she watched their conversation with those remarkably expressive eyes. She couldn't hear the discussion about her future, but she seemed to understand its importance from their body language and expressions. "Reverend," Thomas said quietly, "I believe God intends for us to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Miss Whitfield needs a husband's protection to survive in this world. I can provide that. But what of love, Thomas? What of companionship and the deeper bonds of matrimony?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. Perhaps those things can grow with time and understanding. Right now, survival is more important than romance. Reverend Patterson studied both of them, Thomas with his steady determination and Clara with her quiet dignity. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, but I insist we take time to ensure Miss Whitfield fully understands what marriage entails. This cannot be done in haste." The Reverend approached Clara slowly, speaking clearly so she could read his lips. "Miss Whitfield, do you understand what Sheriff Gray is offering you?" Clara nodded, then pointed to herself and made a gesture of protection, followed by pointing to Thomas and placing her hand over her heart, the same gesture she had made in the street. "She understands," Thomas said softly, though he wasn't entirely sure what that heart gesture meant. "And you, my dear," Reverend Patterson continued, "do you enter this marriage willingly? No one is forcing you." Clara looked directly at Thomas, her hazel eyes searching his face for a long moment. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her, because she nodded firmly and made a gesture with both hands that suggested offering or giving. The ceremony was simple and brief, conducted in the empty church with only Mrs. Patterson as witness. Clara had been given a simple white dress that belonged to the Reverend's daughter, and someone had woven wildflowers into her auburn hair. She looked beautiful and fragile, like a porcelain doll that might break if handled roughly. When it came time for vows, Reverend Patterson adapted the ceremony for Clara's situation. "Thomas Gray, do you take Clara Whitfield to be your wife, to protect and cherish her, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Thomas said clearly, looking into Clara's eyes as he spoke. "Clara Whitfield," the Reverend said, speaking slowly, "do you take Thomas Gray to be your husband, to honor and stand beside him, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Clara nodded solemnly, then did something unexpected. She reached for Thomas's hands and placed them over her heart, holding them there while she looked into his eyes. Then she placed her own hands over his heart, creating a connection that seemed to transcend the need for spoken words. "By the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Patterson said with a gentle smile. "Thomas, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was soft and brief, but Thomas felt Clara's slight tremor as their lips met. When they separated, he saw tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief and something that might have been hope. As they walked from the church to Thomas's modest house at the edge of town, Clara kept one hand resting lightly on his arm. Thomas found himself hyper-aware of her presence beside him. The way she moved with unconscious grace, how she observed everything around them with such intensity, the subtle floral scent that seemed to cling to her hair. Thomas's house was small but well-maintained, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room that reflected his orderly, solitary lifestyle. As he showed Clara around what was now her home, he was struck by how empty and masculine it seemed. There were no feminine touches, no softness or warmth, just the functional belongings of a man who had lived alone for too long. "This is your room," Thomas said, opening the door to the spare bedroom. He had hastily made up the bed with clean sheets and placed a pitcher of fresh water on the washstand. "I'll be right across the hall if you need anything." Clara stepped into the room and looked around slowly, taking in the simple furnishings and the window that looked out over the small garden behind the house. She turned back to Thomas and pressed her palms together, then touched them to her lips, a gesture he interpreted as thanks. That evening, as Thomas sat in his kitchen trying to process the day's events, Clara appeared in the doorway wearing one of his shirts over her dress as a makeshift apron. She had obviously been exploring the kitchen because she pointed to the stove and then to him, raising her eyebrows in a clear question. "You want to cook?" Thomas asked, though he realized she couldn't hear his response. Clara nodded enthusiastically and began opening cabinets and examining his meager supplies. Thomas watched in fascination as she communicated entirely through gestures and expressions, somehow making her intentions perfectly clear without uttering a sound. The meal she prepared was simple but delicious, far better than anything Thomas had managed to create for himself. As they ate together in comfortable silence, Thomas found himself studying Clara's face, Noting the concentration with which she observed his expressions and the graceful way she moved her hands when she wanted to communicate something. After dinner, Clara began clearing the dishes, but Thomas stood to help her. As they worked side by side at the wash basin, their hands occasionally brushed, and Thomas was surprised by the warmth that shot through him at each contact. Clara seemed to feel it too, because she would glance up at him with those remarkable eyes, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. When the kitchen was cleaned, they found themselves standing awkwardly in the sitting room, neither quite sure how to navigate this new relationship. Clara solved the problem by pointing to a book on Thomas's shelf and making a reading gesture. Thomas selected a volume of poetry and sat in his usual chair by the fireplace. Clara surprised him by settling on the floor beside his chair, close enough that she could see the pages as he read. Though she couldn't hear his voice, she followed along with the words, her lips sometimes moving silently as she read. As the evening progressed, Thomas became increasingly aware of Clara's presence, the way the firelight caught the copper highlights in her hair, how she occasionally leaned against his chair when a passage particularly moved her, the peaceful expression on her face as she lost herself in the poetry. When it came time to retire, Clara stood and placed her hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder. She looked into his eyes for a moment, and Thomas felt something pass between them. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. Then she touched her hand to her heart and pointed to him before disappearing into her room. Alone in his own bedroom, Thomas lay awake thinking about the day's extraordinary events. He had married a stranger to protect her, but already Clara was becoming more than just a duty. There was something about her quiet strength, her expressive eyes, and the way she communicated volumes without speaking a word that drew him in ways he hadn't expected. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Thomas realized that his house no longer felt empty. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone, and the silence that had once seemed oppressive now felt peaceful, filled with the presence of someone who understood the value of quiet companionship. In the room across the hall, Clara lay with her hand pressed to her chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat and thinking about the gentle man who had saved her. She couldn't hear his voice, but somehow she had felt his strength, his kindness, and something else, a loneliness that matched her own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they learned to build a life together. But tonight, for the first time in months, Clara felt safe. And in the silence between them, something precious was beginning to grow. 3 weeks into their marriage, Thomas discovered that living with Clara was like learning an entirely new language, one spoken through gestures, expressions, and the subtle art of reading someone's heart through their eyes. What had begun as a protective arrangement was slowly transforming into something deeper, though neither of them had dared to name it yet. The morning routine they had developed spoke of growing comfort and understanding. Clara would wake before dawn and prepare coffee, the rich aroma serving as Thomas's gentle alarm clock. When he emerged from his room, she would greet him with a smile that seemed to light up the entire kitchen, her hands moving in the graceful gestures she used to ask about his plans for the day. "Town patrol this morning," Thomas would say, speaking slowly so she could read his lips, though he suspected she understood more from his movements toward his gun belt and badge than from his words. "I'll be back for lunch." Clara would nod and touch her fingers to her lips, then extend them toward him, her way of saying, "Be safe." It was a gesture that had become precious to Thomas, a daily reminder that someone cared whether he came home. On this particular morning, as Thomas prepared to leave for his rounds, Clara caught his sleeve gently. She pointed toward the door, then to herself, then made a walking motion with her fingers. "You want to come with me?" Thomas asked, surprised. In the 3 weeks since their marriage, Clara had rarely ventured far from the house, seemingly content to create a peaceful domestic haven for them both. Clara nodded eagerly, then gestured toward the basket she had prepared. Thomas realized she wanted to do some shopping, perhaps to add her own touches to their home. As they walked through town together, Thomas was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Some townspeople had accepted their unusual marriage with grudging respect, but others still viewed Clara with suspicion or pity. Thomas positioned himself slightly in front of her, a protective stance that had become second nature. At Henderson's general store, Clara moved through the aisles with purpose, selecting items with the careful consideration of someone managing a limited budget. Thomas watched her examine fabric samples with artistic appreciation, her fingers tracing patterns with the sensitivity of someone who experienced the world primarily through touch and sight. "That would make a beautiful dress," Mrs. Henderson commented, noting Clara's interest in a bolt of blue cotton. "Your wife has excellent taste, Sheriff." Thomas saw Clara glance at him questioningly, having caught only part of the conversation through lip reading. He gestured toward the fabric and nodded approvingly, then mimed the action of sewing. Clara's face lit up with understanding and pleasure. As they continued shopping, Thomas noticed how Clara's presence seemed to soften his interactions with the townspeople. Mrs. Patterson stopped to compliment Clara on the preserves she had made from the wild berries behind their house. Old Mr. Jameson, usually gruff and standoffish, actually smiled when Clara helped him reach a high-shelf item with graceful efficiency. But it was at the post office that their peaceful morning was disrupted. Jake Morrison was there, along with two other men Thomas recognized as troublemakers. They were clearly drunk despite the early hour, and their eyes fixed on Clara with a predatory interest that made Thomas's blood run cold. "Well, look here," Morrison said loudly. "The sheriff's little pet is out for a walk. Tell me, Gray, does she make any noise at all? Or is she as quiet in bed as she is everywhere else?" Thomas stepped between Morrison and Clara, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "Morrison, you're drunk. Go home and sleep it off before you say something you'll regret." "Regret? What's to regret? I'm just curious about your unusual marriage arrangements." Morrison's companion snickered, emboldened by alcohol and group mentality. Clara, who had been standing behind Thomas, suddenly stepped to his side. She looked directly at Morrison, her chin raised with the same dignity Thomas had noticed that first day. Then she did something that surprised everyone. She smiled, a serene expression that somehow managed to convey both pity and dismissal. Without a word, she linked her arm through Thomas's and guided him toward the door, completely ignoring Morrison's crude comments, as if they were beneath her notice. Her composure in the face of deliberate cruelty was so complete that Morrison was left looking foolish and ineffective. Once they were outside, Thomas turned to Clara, concerned. "Are you all right? I'm sorry about that. Morrison's a pig, but he's usually not that bold." Clara touched her fingers to Thomas's chest, right over his heart, and shook her head gently, not in denial, but in reassurance. She had felt his anger, his protective instincts, and she was telling him that Morrison's words couldn't hurt her because she had Thomas's protection. That afternoon, as Thomas worked at his desk in the sheriff's office, he found his thoughts returning to the morning's incident. Clara's grace under pressure had impressed him, but it had also made him realize how much he had come to care about her well-being. The protective feelings he experienced weren't just duty anymore. They were personal, intimate, and surprisingly fierce. When he returned home for dinner, Thomas found Clara in the kitchen, humming. The sound startled him at first. He had never heard her make any vocal sound before. It was soft and melodic, a wordless tune that seemed to express contentment. Clara looked up as he entered, and her face flushed slightly when she realized he had heard her humming. She touched her throat and made a questioning gesture, as if asking whether the sound was acceptable. "That was beautiful," Thomas said, meaning it completely. "I didn't know you could." Clara nodded and touched her throat again, then her chest. Thomas understood. She could feel the vibrations of sound in her body, could create music even if she couldn't hear it. After dinner, as they sat in their usual spots in the sitting room, Clara surprised Thomas by leaving her place on the floor and settling beside him on the small sofa. She pointed to his chest and made a gentle tapping motion. "My heartbeat?" Thomas asked, puzzled. Clara nodded and placed her hand over his heart, her eyes closing in concentration. Thomas held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as he felt the warmth of her palm through his shirt. After a moment, she opened her eyes and smiled, then took his hand and placed it over her own heart. The realization hit Thomas like a physical blow. Clara couldn't hear his voice, but she could feel his heartbeat. In the quiet moments they shared, when she leaned against his chair or sat close beside him, she was listening to the rhythm of his heart, the most honest communication his body could offer. "You hear me?" Thomas whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear the words. "Not my voice, but me." Clara's smile was radiant as she nodded, understanding his amazement. She kept his hand pressed to her heart while she placed her other hand over his, creating a circuit of connection that needed no words. As they sat together in the lamplight, Thomas felt something shift between them. What had begun as protection was becoming partnership. What had started as duty was growing into something that felt suspiciously like love. And Clara, with her gentle strength and her ability to hear the things that mattered most, was teaching him that the most important conversations happen in silence. In the quiet rhythm of two hearts beating in harmony, Thomas began to understand that he hadn't just saved Clara, she was saving him too, one silent moment at a time. Outside, the autumn wind whistled through the trees, but inside their small house, wrapped in the warmth of growing affection and understanding, Thomas and Clara discovered that love had its own language, one that required no sound, only the willingness to listen with your heart. Winter wrapped Cedar Falls in stillness, giving Thomas and Clara more time together by the fire. Silent evenings, shared meals, and quiet moments that deepened their bond without words. Though Thomas had always favored action over speech, Clara taught him that love could speak through gestures, glances, and touch. One evening, Thomas returned home to find Clara wrestling with bread dough, her apron dusted in flour and her brow furrowed in frustration. She greeted him with a flustered smile, miming exhaustion and confusion over the stubborn mixture. "Having trouble with the bread?" he asked, stepping in. She nodded, gesturing wildly. Thomas rolled up his sleeves and joined her. Baking reminded him of his mother, and showing Clara how to knead dough felt unexpectedly intimate. He guided her hands, demonstrating the feel of it, smooth and elastic. When their hands touched, he felt her warmth and noticed her quickened pulse. The closeness between them, already growing over months, intensified. When the dough was set to rise, Clara placed her hand over his heart, listening to its beat, her favorite sound in a silent world. Then, with a new gesture, she pressed her hands to her chest and released them toward him, like letting a bird fly. He realized what she was telling him. She loved him. "Clara," he whispered, gently cupping her face. "I love you too." Clara must have seen the truth in his eyes, because she kissed him. Not a polite kiss, but one filled with passion and promise. When they pulled apart, breathless, they both knew something had changed. That night, Clara knocked softly at Thomas's bedroom door. Her presence, shy and glowing, said more than words ever could. Thomas stepped aside, welcoming her into his room and into a new chapter of their life. Their intimacy was gentle and reverent. Clara, who had once feared closeness, discovered how love transformed vulnerability into beauty. And Thomas, moved by her trust, held her with a depth of care he hadn't known he possessed. Lying together afterward, Clara rested her head on his chest, feeling the steady beat of the heart she had come to know so well. Their marriage had become real, not just in name, but in soul. "I love you," Thomas whispered, knowing she could feel it through him. Clara pressed a kiss to his chest, her way of saying it back. That night, they became true husband and wife, bound not just by vows, but by something deeper, the language of hearts. A language without sound, but rich in meaning, one they had written together, touch by touch, moment by moment. In the morning, they would wake as partners in every sense, their love a quiet, living promise for the days to come.